Hey, greetings and welcome back. I've been thinking a lot about Saul Leiter's photograph, Café, Paris of 1959, and it's actually been on my mind for over a year, ever since I bought David Campany's book on photographs. And you know, when I first turned to the image, it really it jumped off the page at me, and my experience was really of being quite puzzled because it looked so little like a photograph. And of course it is a photograph, but I was immediately struck by the idea that something else is going on here. So I've been going back to it and thinking about it and studying it ever since. Another reason I've been thinking about this image is that about 4 weeks before I started working on this video, I Googled it and I discovered that it sold at auction for a price of just over £5,000, which I'm going to say was a terrific bargain for the buyer. But anyway, my interest in this image starts with something that actually Campany mentions in his commentary on it and immediately dismisses. He says that photographs are often described as painterly, but that this comparison can't mean much because, in his words, a painting can look like anything, which, you know, on a broad level, that is a fair thing to say. But sometimes there are such obvious and powerful connections between different mediums that they're really worth exploring. And it's not just that this image looks painterly or like a painting, because it both does and it doesn't. There's some complexity there, and so that description's not exactly right. But rather, it's really more about the way Leiter can be seen as working with and updating a certain sensibility that maybe we first saw arise in painting. So let's think about this photograph in the context of French Impressionism. First, there's the subject matter. The Impressionists often painted street scenes and images of life in Parisian cafes and bars. And Impressionism produced a number of memorable images of women in cafes. And it seems that reading and writing is also a common theme as well. So Leiter's image is perfectly in harmony with some of Impressionism's favorite subject matter. But let me read something to you that Meyer Shapiro wrote about Impressionism in his sweeping work on the topic subtitled Impressions and Reflections, or Reflections and Impressions. So here's what he does. He makes this really important step. Rather than talking about Impressionism as a style of painting, he describes it as a mode of perception. And here's what he writes. He says, valuing the mode of perception called the impression, these new artists differed from psychologists and philosophers in isolating and exploring the impression as a prized experience, and not just as one stage among others in the process of knowledge. The painters singled out the impression as fertile ground of art that they opposed to analytical thought and observation. The impression, with its component sensations, was viewed as a basic, primitive experience, an occasion in which we are most sincere, responsive, and capable of grasping totalities as aesthetic values. Now, I think that's just a marvelous way of describing what's at stake in Impressionism. What Shapiro is proposing is that Impressionism was invested in a different optical and cognitive and emotional reality, one that sought to isolate one aspect of seeing and trying to figure out what it did. And you know, Shapiro does this by, or announces this by contrasting it with observation. And as photographers, this distinction between impression and observation can be challenging because obviously in photography, observation is so highly valued. And it's considered so central to photography's job that we often take a photograph to be an observation whether it is or not. And so the idea of the impression in photography today could seem just as outlandish as it did to academic painters of the late 19th century. So I would say that a productive way to understand this distinction might be to say that the impression could be thought of as something internal. It's our immediate reaction to something before we fully grasp it, without having the understanding that comes later with study. The Impressionists sought to create images capable of capturing that initial response and sort of freezing it, stopping it from developing into something else. Observation, on the other hand, is aligned with science, with representational exactitude. And those were the values of the academic painters of the late 19th century. They believed that skill as a painter and the job of painting was to create extremely accurate representations of the people and places in the image. And, we do need to keep in mind that the Impressionists were responding to that academic tradition. And while an image like this one might strike us today as very much being an observation because we get a sense of the woman as an individual, the rendering of the details of her face, her hair, her dress, these are far more abstract than was acceptable by the conventions of the day. But let's look at another image. The canvas by Claude Monet, responsible for the label Impressionism being tied to this kind of painting. It's a lot easier to understand this as an impression, right? I mean, it has to be related to its lack of detail. We get an overall powerful sense of the scene due to its colors and tonal values, but the actual details are vague. I mean, we get a hint of ships or industrial architecture in the background, and the water seems like water without being realistic. And the people in the boat are really just smudges. They are obviously dabs of paint, but done in such a way that they appear to be figures at the same time. And this is really one of the most important aspects of Impressionism. It is both abstract and representational at the same time. Parts of an image might look and feel realistic, but other details are muted or obscured. And it's this play of abstraction and representation that is so enticing for the human brain. Now, photographers can't mute details the same way the painters can, but Leiter's photo embodied a nuanced play between representation and abstraction, between showing and obscuring detail. So overall, the cafe image has a very soft feel to it. Even the sections that are in focus. And this is caused, I think, by the muted color palette, the very soft lighting that predominates the image, the softness of the film grain, the fall off in the depth of field. Also, the image is shot through a window, and that's adding reflections to the image that are very subtly obscuring the details. And most notably, Leiter's own reflection in the window overlaps with the woman's hair, changing its appearance to us. Now, we also note that a small number of things in the frame do have clear detail. The newsprint, the cups and bottle on the table, the rattan chair. These are things that ground the image in a certain sense of reality. But then let's look at the people in the image. They are all obscured in various ways. I mean, first of all, with the woman in the foreground, we only see about a third of her face. I don't think we could recognize her if we saw her walking down the street. Next, you've got the man seated next to her who only shows up as a knee and a hand holding a cigarette. The identity of the woman in the background is totally obscured, both because her hand is held up to her face and because the fall off in depth of field puts her out of focus. And then there's her companion who's just cut off by the edge of frame. Finally, we've got the people in the far background, and they are really essentially reduced to smudges. This lack of detail concerning the people in the image changes the emphasis of the image. Ultimately, it's more like Monet's painting. It's more about an overall emotional impact of the scene than it is about creating a specific, detailed representation of like well-defined subject matter. So let me draw another point of comparison, this time between Leiter's photo and Degas' painting of women on a cafe terrace. Now, both of these images depict what's called limited space, which means they juxtapose areas of visual depth with areas of visual flatness. The lower half of Leiter's photo contains depth cues in the way objects overlap each other, such as the items on the table, most prominently the soda water bottle overlapping the chairs behind it. Another depth cue is the way that objects change size as they get farther away. Again, look at the chairs. The chairs closer to us are larger, the ones farther away are smaller. Then we also have the same effect with the women in the frame. The woman in the foreground is larger than the woman in the background is. So those are all depth cues, and they all occur in the lower portion of the frame. Now look at the top third of the image. It contains no depth cues at all. It is extremely flat and even a bit abstract. And while some would say it's just out of focus, aided by the reflections that are being caught in the window, it really creates an impression of something that's flat and gauzy and indistinct. So it's not just that it's out of focus, it's that it's completely flat in relationship to the areas of depth in the lower portion of the frame. Now, look at Degas' painting. We see that in its lower portion, it has the same depth cues that the photograph does. We see objects overlapping each other, such as the way the cafe chair overlaps the table and the arm of the woman wearing dark clothes. Then we see a change in relative size between the women on the left, who are closer, and the woman in the center of the frame, who is slightly farther away. But again, let's look at the top area of the image. The top half is extremely flat and abstract, void of the depth cues found in the lower area of the image. Now, also note that this painting and Leiter's photo position the viewer inside the cafe looking out. And then notice that there's a strong affinity between the colors in these images, the desaturated yellows, and the fact that two of the women are wearing similar shades of blue. I mean, this is a delightful coincidence. On the other hand, though, the use of limited and flat space, both in Impressionism and in Leiter's work, that's not really a coincidence at all, because it seems that for a lot of artists, as they become more concerned with abstraction and other means of representation, it's only natural that they start to move away from the rigorous illusionistic space found traditionally in like academic painting and, of course, in photography. So Leiter's work has a lot in common with Impressionism, but to be clear, I don't think he was trying to copy them. He wasn't doing an exercise in style. He was genuinely operating from a similar understanding. I mean, remember, he was an accomplished painter himself, and he was familiar with these ideas. So his approach to creating images was a lot more about the elements that we mentioned earlier from Shapiro, in particular this new perception. And even if the example of the cafe photo is ultimately too nuanced for some people, other examples are far more dramatic. These images are not informed by traditional vision or the desire to make city space comprehensible. Leiter's vision's transgressive. It combines the representational and the abstract in ways that make the city far less intelligible and way less rational. And he mixes up mystery and melancholy, and he's challenging our expectations of how the city is to be seen, as well as our own physical position as spectators within these spaces. So ultimately then, what I think Leiter was doing was that really he was working with and updating and transforming these ideas and giving them to us in a uniquely photographic way. So I know that was long and I apologize, but I'm curious, what do you think? Does the comparison with Impressionism hold water for you? And, I want to come back to that distinction between the impression and the observation. As photographers yourselves, do you work within those modalities, or do you have other concerns that are paramount when you're creating images? Anyway, leave some comments below. I'd really like to know what you think. That's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.